two men make their way through the dark streets of St. Petersburg. One is in disguise, a wanted man. They are stopped en route by a government patrol, but the police don't recognize their man and let him pass. It was to prove a huge mistake. The man they had taken for a drunken tramp was in fact about to change the course of history. If he had been arrested, he would not have reached these revolutionary headquarters in time. Without him, there would have been no October Revolution, no Soviet communism, and the world in which we live would be entirely different. Few events have been more profoundly distorted by myth than the Great October Socialist Revolution. The image of the Bolshevik insurrection as a bloody struggle by the working masses owes more to this film than historical fact. Sergei Eisenstein's October became a cinematic epic and a convenient smokescreen for the truth about the foundation of Soviet communism. Marxist ideology dictates that the masses make history, not great men or individuals. This was the message of Eisenstein's film, the power of the masses. Yet behind the myth was the worship of Lenin as a demigod who had shown the people the way. In fact, few Russians would have recognized Lenin in 1917. He had spent 17 years in exile abroad and was only able to return to Russia that year because the masses had already revolted without him. He was not even in the country when the February Revolution forced the Tsar to bow to public opinion and abdicate. The crowds rejoiced at the people's victory. The focus of their hopes were the newly established Soviet councils, made up of delegates from many different socialist parties. The Soviets shared power with the provisional government. It was a dual-party setup, and the hero of the hour was Alexander Kerensky, the only politician with a position both in the government and the Soviet. But on his return to Russia in April 1917, Lenin began to agitate for all power to the Soviets. Increasingly, the masses themselves came to see the Soviets as their political voice. Unemployment and inflation eroded their support for the provisional government. Lenin saw it as a matter of picking up power off the streets. Soldiers, too, grew apathetic and deserted Russia's First World War front in their thousands. As his power waned, Kerensky enthroned himself in the Winter Palace and began to live just like a Tsar, cut off from the people. Rumors spread of his secret mistresses, his drug abuse, and his foreign friends who were out to ruin Russia's new democracy. Now the power question focused on the Soviet. Would it form a government?
Под советским правительством понималось правительство, составленное из всех советских партий, то есть из большевиков, из меньшевиков, из народных социалистов и эсеров, или еще там из каких-нибудь социалистических групп. И вот, когда говорили о советской власти, то и делегаты съезда, депутаты тоже думали о таком правительстве, в которое войдут представители многих партий, а не только одной.
The Smolny Institute, a former boarding school for noble girls, was the headquarters of the Soviet. Its classrooms transformed into the offices of various socialist parties. By October, it had become an internal arena of revolution. John Reed, an American journalist, said it hummed like a gigantic hive. Soldiers ran round with their messages, their boots echoing on the stone floors. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the stench of urine. The center of life was the ornate ballroom, where the noisy sessions of the Soviet were held. A crucial conference was planned for October, when Soviet delegates from all over Russia would gather here to vote on whether to form a Soviet government. Lenin's left-wing Bolsheviks doubted the delegates' resolve to oust Kerensky. Should they try to persuade them or seize power themselves? Lenin had no doubt. He convened a secret meeting of the Bolshevik party leaders in this apartment block. He insisted on the need for an armed uprising, claiming that it would be naive to wait for a formal majority in the Soviet. No revolution ever waits for that. In Eisenstein's version, Lenin's powers of persuasion were absolute. But two leaders voted against an insurrection. One of them was Liev Kamyenev, who published his opposition to a coup. The news even reached the London Times, which reported that the feeling among the working population is hostile to the action the Bolsheviks are planning. Lenin needed a fighting cause to sting the workers into action. Kerensky gave him one. Startled by rumors of insurrection, he closed down the Bolshevik news presses at Pravda and, fearing mass mutiny, ordered the militant Petersburg soldiers out of the city to the front line. He inadvertently fired the opening shots of the revolution.
Kerensky seriously underestimated the Bolsheviks' military strength, and by his action gave them precisely what they needed to persuade their followers that the revolution was in danger and had to be defended on the streets.
The Military Revolutionary Committee took up the task. Under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, it posed as an organ of Soviet defense. It seized control of the Peter and Paul fortress, whose cannons overlooked the Winter Palace and the provisional government inside. By October the 23rd, the city was under siege. The provisional government improvised defenses around the Winter Palace. At Smolny, too, security measures were stepped up. Rumors abounded that Kerensky planned an attack to prevent them from reclaiming Soviet power. They turned the building into an armed camp. Trotsky insisted that all this was an act of defense. But as Lenin walked that night to the Smolny, he was determined to turn it into attack. Paradoxically, Lenin did not want the Congress to vote for Soviet power. A yes vote by the ballot box would translate into a coalition government in which the Bolsheviks would only be one of many parties represented here. Lenin would not be the central figure. He might not even get into the cabinet. But if he seized power before the Congress met, he could dictate the terms of government and open the way to a Bolshevik dictatorship. Shortly before midnight on October the 24th, Lenin finally arrived at his destination. The scene which greeted him was still one of armed defense. The building was ablaze, like an ocean liner in the dark night sea. Machine guns were set up at the gates where the Red Guards checked the passes of the Soviet delegates. Most of the Bolsheviks were still prepared to wait for the Soviet Congress to cast their votes. But once inside, Lenin harangued the party leaders to seize power. In the tense atmosphere that prevailed, his persuasion was absolute. A map of the city was brought out, and the main lines of assault on the government drawn up. Lenin's insurrection had begun. The plan for the Bolshevik insurrection was simple, but its execution far from straightforward. The Great October Socialist Revolution was in fact a catalogue of ludicrous errors. The cruiser Aurora was late arriving, and it was her guns and sailors that were to announce the start of the assault.
For Lenin, all these delays were maddening. It was essential for him to have the seizure of power before the opening of the Congress, and he was clearly running out of time. The Military Revolutionary Committee member, Podvoisky, tells us that he paced up and down in a room in the Smolny like a lion. He was ready to pounce.
There was another problem. The attack on the Winter Palace was due to begin with the heavy field guns of the Peter and Paul fortress. But at the final moment, it was discovered that these were rusty museum pieces which could not be fired. In fact, as evening approached, the palace could have been captured with barely a shot. The government ministers inside watched and waited for the inevitable. Kerensky had fled in a futile search for loyal troops from the front, and those left improvised the palace's defense. John Reed described a large, ornate room with rows of dirty mattresses on which soldiers were stretched out. The place was like a huge barracks. 200 women from the Battalion of Death were among the last soldiers to defend the government. Reed tried to enter through a locked door into this hall and was told that it was shut to keep the soldiers in. Everywhere was a litter of cigarette butts, bits of bread, and empty bottles with expensive French labels. The last vestiges of a civilization. But there was no food to give the soldiers dinner, and by the evening all but 300 had slipped away to the restaurants of the city. John Reed himself was dining at this time at the Hotel France, just off Palace Square. After his soup, at around 9 o'clock, he was asked by the waiter to move to the dining hall at the back of the building, in case shooting should begin. The mood on the streets that night was remarkably normal. Theatre goers promenading amongst the Red Guards. Even in the workers' district, everything was quiet. In the Winter Palace, the ministers too were sitting down to eat borscht, steamed fish, and artichokes, when an ultimatum arrived from the Bolsheviks. They decided to be brave and rejected. They did at least get to finish their dinner while the Bolsheviks tried to solve the problem of the faulty field guns. Then at 9:40 p.m., the signal was finally given by one blank round from the Aurora. The huge blast caused the brave ministers to hide under the table, while the women's battalion of death became hysterical and had to be taken away to a room at the back of the palace. Just as the bombardment was getting underway, the Soviet Congress finally opened. The great hall was packed with workers and soldiers in their tunics and greatcoats, all keen to talk about Soviet power. Suddenly, Martov, the leader of the Menshevik Party, proposed the formation of a coalition Soviet government. His proposal was greeted with a great cheer and passed without a vote. But this was not the Soviet power Lenin had intended.
I don't think Lenin wanted a broad Soviet coalition or even a Soviet government in the sense of one ruled by the Soviet Congress. Everything suggests that what he wanted was a Bolshevik dictatorship from the start, and that's precisely why it was so important for him to seize power before the Congress opened, to provoke the other socialist parties from walking out in protest.
The storming of the Winter Palace was underway. Eisenstein portrayed it as a bloody battle fought by a huge army, but in fact, the numbers were quite small. The palace entrances were left unguarded, and only a few dozen soldiers were needed. The legend of the storming was on a far grander scale than reality.
На самом деле это было со стороны левого подъезда Зимнего, со стороны площади, лестница, которую потом и сегодня называют Октябрьской. Вот туда Эйзенштейна привели и рассказали, вот здесь, значит, был осуществлен этот штурм. Эйзенштейн сказал, что это слишком узенькая лестница, ему здесь не развернуть массовку, поэтому попросил показать какую-нибудь другую. Ему показали Орданскую лестницу, он снял штурм Зимнего дворца по этой лестнице, которого на самом деле не было, и тем положил начало вот кинематографическому штампу, соответственно которому все последующие режиссеры говорили: о, раз великий Эйзенштейн снимал здесь, значит так и было.
At the top, the stormers reached the White Dining Room, where Kerensky's ministers were finally arrested.
Самое интересное, что меня, например, поразило, это то, когда они вошли в Зимний дворец, что всюду там находились служители во всех залах, которые несли круглосуточное дежурство. И вот служители говорили: вам куда? К Временному правительству? Вот сюда, пожалуйста. Вот так, таким цивилизованным путем проходил штурм Зимнего дворца.
At 2:10, the Bolsheviks stopped the clock, supposedly to mark the beginning of a new socialist world order. For Russia's democracy, it marked the beginning of the end. Back at the Soviet Congress, the news of the storming and arrest was greeted with uproar by the more moderate socialist parties, and many representatives walked out in protest. Lenin's plan had worked. The other political parties had abandoned the Soviet to him and the Bolsheviks. Martov stayed to plead the cause of compromise, only to be denounced by Trotsky shouting, "Go where you belong, into the dustbin of history." Walking towards the door, Martov warned the remaining delegates, "One day you will understand the crime in which you are taking part." Now the Bolsheviks voted for Soviet power and read out their decrees on bread, land, and peace. For the mass of the delegates, this was what the revolution was about. In Soviet propaganda, bread, land, and peace were given to the people by Lenin. Eisenstein's film created the illusion of a people's victory. But But in reality, the great socialist revolution went largely unnoticed by the inhabitants of St. Petersburg. It was a small-scale military coup. The day after the insurrection, the only damage found to the Winter Palace was a broken window on the 3rd floor. How many people took part in the insurrection? Barely 5% of the workers and the soldiers in the capital. These Civil War veterans were extras in Eisenstein's film. Many brought their own props, live ammunition. It is rumored that many more were injured in the shooting of his film than in the original October days. An old palace guard sweeping up the glass told Eisenstein, "Your people were much more careful last time." And of those who took part in the insurrection, not all were inspired by the communist ideal. When the Bolsheviks took over the Winter Palace, they discovered the largest wine cellar in the world. The stormers helped themselves to the Tsar's favorite wines and went on a drunken rampage. The Winter Palace was vandalized. The Bolsheviks tried in vain to stem the violence. They posted guards around the cellar who licensed themselves to sell off the liquor. They pumped wine out into the streets, but crowds gathered in the gutter to drink it. For several weeks, the anarchy continued until finally, the alcohol ran out, and the capital woke up with a hangover to the world's first communist government. The guard who mistook Lenin for a harmless drunk probably never realized the significance of his mistake. The man who walked through the streets of the capital that night changed the course of the 20th century. If he had been stopped, there would have been no Bolshevik revolution. The Soviet Congress would have formed a coalition government. Russia might have become a democracy. But with Lenin in control, Russia had embarked on a course of civil war and dictatorship, which would end with the murder of millions.